Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupine Avataravarishthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. We have a very interesting and very important subject before us. Sri Ramakrishna's gift to the world. Now when we think of the spiritual legacy of Sri Ramakrishna, we find that from the Indian context, he is a continuation of an ancient lineage of spiritual preceptors, teachers, saints and sages who appeared in India from time to time and gave a new interpretation to the ancient truths revealed in the Vedic literature. But from the Western perspective, maybe in a broader sense from the standpoint of the rest of the world, Sri Ramakrishna and his unique contribution should be viewed in the light of the evolution of spiritual thought right from the beginning of human civilization. Maybe he will be remembered for giving this unique message of harmony of religions. I mean, he didn't himself found a new religion. He was not at the heart of any new religious movement as such. But he admired, accepted, respected and appreciated all religious traditions that emerged in different parts of the world, all over the world. So that was his unique legacy. He was so religious that he could see the genuineness of every human quest for truth, every human spiritual endeavor was appreciated by him. That's why in his life you find he practiced Christianity, he practiced Sufism, and he practiced different denominations of Hindu religious tradition. And he didn't see any difference because he himself had reached that level of spiritual experience where he could appreciate every human endeavor in any language, in any tradition, in any culture as a genuine approach to supreme reality. Well, I can't express this more forcefully than by quoting the words of one of the most prominent literary figures of 20th century, Romain Rolland, the French novelist, dramatist, and he was also given Nobel Award. I mean, he was a Nobel Prize winner for literature. Now, he has written a very small book, not very small, but certainly not a large work, The Life of Sri Ramakrishna. He wrote that in French and it was translated into English by E.F. Malcolm Smith. And there he writes something very interesting. There is at the beginning of the book, there is a short introduction. And that introduction is the interesting subtitle, To My Western Readers. So he is introducing Sri Ramakrishna to his Western readers. In a broader sense, he is introducing Sri Ramakrishna to those who are not familiar with India's spiritual tradition, because Indians look upon, or Hindus look upon, Sri Ramakrishna as an incarnation, as a continuation of the ancient lineage of teachers, as I mentioned earlier. But for Western world, there is something unique about Sri Ramakrishna, and I think that is more relevant to our times. That aspect of Sri Ramakrishna is much more relevant and important to our times. Because Sri Ramakrishna, as I mentioned, that's the uniqueness. He did not found a new religion. At the same time, he is considered to be the beginning. He represents the beginning of a new religious approach, altogether an entirely new approach to religion as such. So Roman Rolla writes, I am bringing to Europe, as yet unaware of it, the fruit of a new autumn, a new message of the soul, the symphony of India, bearing the name of Ramakrishna. Now remember, he was a great novelist and dramatist. So he has his own unique and charming and forceful way of putting things. It can be shown, and we shall not fail to point out, that this symphony, like those of our classical masters, is built up of 100 different musical elements emanating from the past. Is actually referring to the musical tradition of Germany, France, Italy, and so on. So many great masters. Of course, other nations also. So many great musical geniuses who contributed to this global symphony of spiritual music. So that's a forceful language in which Romain Rolland puts his idea. It can be shown that this symphony, like those of our classical masters, is built up of 100 different musical elements emanating from the past. But the sovereign personality concentrating himself the diversity of these elements and fashioning them into a royal harmony is always the one who gives his name to the work, though it contains within itself the labor of generations. A great musical genius is not unique in one way because he is a continuation. So in his musical tradition, there are elements of his predecessors who have made contribution in succeeding generations, and that's what he is driving at. And with his victorious sign, he marks a new era. The man whose image I here evoke was the consummation of 2,000 years of the spiritual life of 300 million people. Although he has been dead 40 years, Sri Ramakrishna passed away in the year 1886, and this book was written just about 40 years after Sri Ramakrishna's passing away. His soul animates modern India. He was no hero of action like Gandhi, no genius or in art or thought like Goethe or Tagore. He was a little village Brahmin of Bengal whose outer life was set in a limited frame without striking incident outside the political and social activities of his time. I won't go further. The idea is, in fact, these few sentences coming from a master novelist, and he was given Nobel Prize not only for literature but for his appreciation of great truths in all traditions. That's what the citation read actually. That is the uniqueness of Romain Rolland. So he could capture in his own unique way the light coming from Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual legacy, because he was a very unique person, but he was a very ordinary person. That's why he is comparing Sri Ramakrishna to Gandhi. Gandhi was, of course, a very ordinary person in one way, but it was a dynamo of energy. He was going all over India, organizing people and leading agitations against the British Empire. He actually made the British Empire collapse in front of his eyes. Tagore was a great poet, and there were many other great men and women all over the world who are known for great philosophical contributions, their intellectual genius, great scientific geniuses, and so on. But Sri Ramakrishna didn't boast of any of this. But that itself was his uniqueness. And that's what we are going to discuss this morning. Now the point is, in his work, which I am going to focus a little on, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which contains Sri Ramakrishna's instructions written down in a diary by one of his householder disciples. You can find Sri Ramakrishna the embodiment of compassion, sheer pragmatism, and again a positive approach to everything. Sometimes atheists came to visit him in his small room in the temple Dakshineshwar. Agnostics came, and conservative traditional temple goers came, Sanskrit scholars came, and also those who didn't accept Hinduism, those who questioned everything about Hinduism, they also came. Christians came, Sufis came, many others came. Now they all found something in him, and they all received something from him, because he had only a positive message to give. You are following your path, go ahead. But remember, your path is not the only path. There are other ways. Because here is the top of the spiritual hill. So he could look down and he could see that there are innumerable, an infinite number of trails and roads and paths that one could take from the top, from the bottom of the hill to reach the top. Because here is the top, the spiritual experience, the oneness of creation, the oneness of existence. So his doors before anyone. So he appreciated everyone, he encouraged everyone, but he gave warning. Remember, your path is okay, but other man's path is also okay. Don't think you are the only one who is right, the other one is also right. Means the universality, the harmony of culture, religion, and spirituality. So his pragmatism and his compassion, all that you find in him. Now, when you think of Sri Ramakrishna's times, that's very interesting. He was born in 1836. He passed away in 1886. So from 1836 to 1886, just about 50 years nearly. And he was in the city of Calcutta from the early 1850s till his passing away. So that was the time when Calcutta was the center of all the political and social reform activities in India. And there were, of course, newspapers. In their own time there were printed newspapers. So people were talking about the emergence of nationalism in Europe, the Franco-Prussian War, the turmoil in Russia, Rasputin they were talking about. You can hear all, if you read the newspapers published, which are available in archives in India. These were some of the items that people were discussing. American Civil War. All this happened when Sri Ramakrishna was living in Calcutta, which was the center of the intellectual, the political and social reform activities in India. People from all over Indian subcontinent, including today's Burma, of course today's Bangladesh, today's Pakistan, or even Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. They all came to that city. This is the seat of British colonial rule. And again in Europe, there were great intellectual movements. In maybe 1858, perhaps the Origin of Species was published, and in 1867 the first volume of Karl Marx Das Kapital. All these created waves in India and also in Europe and also the east coast of America. So they were very turbulent times that were happening in Calcutta at that time. Now, there was one man to whom we are indebted for the unique spiritual classic known as the Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And his name was Mahendranath Gupta. He was a typical product of the modern education system in India at that time. He was well read in Bible, he knew Sanskrit, he was a member of the Brahma Samaj, which was actually, in the words of Annie Besant, an attempt to Christianize India from within. That is Annie Besant, the great Indian nationalist. She came to India and she adopted India as her country. She was predecessor to Sister Nivedita. She said that was the movement known as Brahma Samaj, and this Mahendranath Gupta, who later became maybe the greatest householder disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, was such a person. He was a semi-agnostic. But he came to Sri Ramakrishna and he got a new life. And he writes, interesting, he writes, because he used to come to the Dakshineshwar. Accidentally he came to the Dakshineshwar. His own family life was not very pleasant. He had a lot of problems, large family, not enough money, and there were quarrels among them. One day he left his home in search of some consolation, some peace of mind, and he traveled all over the Calcutta city, many streets, accompanied by his wife. Eventually, at the middle of night, he reached his nephew's home, Siddheswar Majumdar, and he stayed there for a few days. After a few days, that gentleman told him, uncle, there is a holy man living in a temple, Dakshineshwar temple, on the banks of Ganga. Shall we go there? And they walked to Dakshineshwar temple, and he accidentally stepped into the room, not to make, he saw from outside, and Sri Ramakrishna was sitting there talking to his disciples. That is the beginning of a new life in the life of this man, Mahendranath Gupta, who was actually contemplating on committing suicide. And he got a new life, a spiritual life. So that's the man we are talking about. And you know what he writes? I used to memorize the master's words, and then after returning home, I would write brief notes in my diary. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is the English translation of the diary. Sometimes I would spend the whole night in completing my record. And you find in the original recording, you find this I directly heard and I am recording here. This I heard from others that I am recording here. You can find he was a very meticulous diary writer. And later I would fill in all the details from memory. Sometimes I would spend 7 days completing the record of one day's happenings. And then when he actually completed this, after Sri Ramakrishna's passing away, he published this. And Swami Vivekananda, apparently reading the first few pamphlets, which were English translations of Mahendranath's writings, diary writings in original Bengali, which he himself translated into English. Swami Vivekananda writes, the movie is quite original. Never was the life of a great teacher brought before the public untarnished by the writer's mind, as you are doing. And Swami, Vivekananda writes later, it is totally unlike Socrates and Plato, because whatever Plato wrote is his own head, his own ideas in the mouth of Socrates. But Mahendranath Gupta didn't stand in the way of Sri Ramakrishna's addressing the readers, because he is completely hidden, concealed. He put the ideas as he heard from Sri Ramakrishna, making himself totally invisible. And the book begins with this. The first writing begins with this. A famous verse in the Bhagavata Purana. It is Tava Kathamudam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhirididam Kalmashapakam Sravanamangalam Simadatatam Bhuvi Grinantite Bhurita Janaha. It's a very interesting verse for the Bhagavata Purana. It's called Gopika Geetam. These little cowherd girls were admiring Krishna as God himself. They were all small little babies, children. So they were the embodiments of the highest and purest devotion. The nectar of your words and the descriptions of your activities are the life and soul of those suffering in the material world. And these narrations given by learned sages from generation to generation, they bestow good fortune upon those who hear them, and they become the ship by which they cross the ocean of these life cycles of pains and happiness and sufferings. So this is how he actually begins. In fact, that invocation itself is unique in many ways. Tava kathamurdam tapta jivanam kavibhiki ididam kalmashapakam. It is a great healing spiritual healing touch that everyone gets who reads and who listen to Sri Ramakrishna's words, which is now known as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, a classic of pure spirituality, which is universal, is practical, simple, and straight. Now, about the writings of this book, M himself writes, that's a very interesting thing. He says, the master made me start keeping a diary in 1867 when I was a student of class 8 at higher school. So 1867, the master made me start keeping a diary. Since then, I recorded in my journal my daily activities, the places I had visited, and so on when I met master in the later part of 1882. So what M is writing is this. I don't have time to go through the whole letter, His own school teacher suggested to him, this little boy M. Mahendranath Gupta, to keep or to write diary notes every day, and he obeyed his teacher. In 1882, he happened to meet Sri Ramakrishna. So the old habit of writing diary notes became a great boon. And then Sri Ramakrishna himself once said, the Divine Mother had told me that you have to do a little work for her. You will have to teach the Bhagavata, the word of God, to humanity. God binds the Bhagavata Pandit to the world with duties, otherwise who would remain to explain the sacred book? He keeps the Pandit bound for the good of men. That's why the Divine Mother has kept you in the world. It needs some explanation. M's family life was very turbulent. A big family, joint family. Nephews, brothers, distant cousins, all staying together under the same roof, 3 generations in one roof, as was practiced in those days. And he was a very prominent man. He was an intellectual. He was a celebrity. He was familiar with the contemporary literary movements in Europe and India, and also he was familiar with the scriptures. He knew Sanskrit so well. But there was a lingering pain in his heart. So this pain, these sufferings, really is a mechanism by which God made him a useful instrument for the good of humanity. Suppose Yam didn't have any problem, he would probably have led a very happy material life, or he would have become a monk, a mendicant. In both cases, he would not be a public property, because if he became a monk is not bound by a set of duties and responsibilities. And if he became an ordinary well-to-do man, then also it's very unlikely that he will sacrifice anything for the good of others. So Sri Ramakrishna says the Divine Mother keeps the Bhagavata Pandit. Bhagavata Pandit means, Bhagavata here means the great of Vyasa, known as Bhagavata Mahapurana. As a metaphor, it means that any devotional work, any writings or set of instructions that talk about God and spiritual life. So Yam was born with this sacred responsibility of writing down Sri Ramakrishna's message, his teachings, his words, so that the rest of the world will be benefited. For that, he was kept in a state of worldly bondage. That's what Sri Ramakrishna is talking about. And this Yam, as I mentioned, was a very respected person, a well-respected headmaster in those days. Unfortunately not today, but in those days, the headmaster of a school in the locality, he will be almost some kind of he will be a great intermediary in all village quarrels. His word will be the last, because 2 or 3 generations of the elderly villages will be his own students, so they will listen to him. And when a teacher tells you, at least in those days, they were expected to obey the teacher. So Yam was a highly respected person. Remember, many of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, the monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, were recruited by Yam and sent to Sri Ramakrishna by him. Vivekananda himself was directed to Sri Ramakrishna by his British professor who was teaching William Wordsworth's Excursion, where he wanted to explain the meaning of the word trance that Wordsworth used, which he could not clearly explain. So he thought maybe Sri Ramakrishna, seeing Sri Ramakrishna would give an idea of what William Wordsworth was trying to imply. That's how Vivekananda, as a university student of Scottish Church College, happened to land in the room where Sri Ramakrishna was living in the Dakshineshwar temple. So that was the glorious time of headmasters and teachers. You can imagine. Now, and he was a very respectable man. I am quoting from a very well-known book. The name of the book is A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. It's a landmark publication. There was a great British journalist who came to America, and from here he went to India. He met Ramana Maharshi, and also he met Yam. And it is said that Paramahamsa Yogananda, when he was a young man there, used to take a walk along with Mahendranath Gupta along the banks of Ganga. And Paul Brunton went to Calcutta and met Yam in the early decades of 20th century. And you know what Paul Brunton writes? You can get an idea of the type of person, the physical and the spiritual personality of Yam you can get here. A venerable patriarch has stepped from the pages of the Bible. He's talking about Old Testament. And a figure from the Mosaic times has turned into flesh. These are the words of Paul Brunton, writing about Yam. Paul Brunton went to the place where Yam was living, Mahendranath Gupta. He had to wait for a short time, and after some time, Mahendranath Gupta appeared. He entered the room, and as he entered the room, Paul Brunton gave a close look, and later he wrote in his book, A Search in Secret India, a venerable patriarch has stepped from the pages of the Bible, and a figure from the Mosaic times has turned into flesh. That is Yam. Now, how did Yam himself happen to really come to Sri Ramakrishna? I have already mentioned this. There is a particular stage in the life cycle of a spiritual person where at one stage, as he looks back, he will understand that all the problems and hardship that he had to face were so many stepping stones towards a glorious future. Without those failures, without those hard times, he would not have accomplished all that he had really accomplished. That in a way partly explains the life of Yam. Yasya anugraham ichchami tasya vittam haramyaham bandhavaisa viyogena bhrisham bhavati dukkhidaha tena dukkena samtapto yadimam na parityajet tam prasadam karishyami yad devairabi sudurlabh. This is in ancient Sanskrit verse. What it means is, those whom God wants to bless, show some special grace, he will give that devotee a lot of blows, not a very pleasant way of showing his love and affection. But that's what really happens to those chosen privileged few who deserve God's special grace. Because these are the very struggles and hard times that prepare the person to become the real great saint that he is going to become. So what the sloka means is, those whom I want to bless, I shall take away all his wealth, I shall get him isolated from his friends. Still, if he doesn't desert me, abandon me, and still remembers me, then I shall elevate him to such a position that he will be an envy of angels. That is the literal meaning of this particular verse. You can find that happening to Vyasa, even the author of Bhagavata Purana. He was the greatest scholar, writer, author, and one of the greatest well-known figures in ancient India among the saints and sages. But he was suffering from depression and withdrawal symptom. So one day he was sitting on the banks of the river Saraswati, and then another sage appeared, Narada, and he found Vyasa in a pensive mood. Then Narada asked him, what's the matter? And Vyasa said, well, of course I have achieved a lot, but still I am not very happy. Then Narada told him, you have done a lot of work, you have written some masterpieces, but you have to do something much more and much more important and practical and relevant and necessary for the people. You should write a book on practical spirituality, describing the incarnations of Lord Krishna, his teachings, and the episodes, spiritual episodes and events that happen in his lifespan. And Vyasa wrote the great Bhagavata Purana. When he finished the last word, Satyam Param Dhimahi, the 12th skandha, 12th book of the Bhagavata Purana, he got peace of mind. Similarly, what happened to Yam, as I mentioned, Yam, I'm just reading the beginning of the gospel. That gives an idea of Sri Ramakrishna's approach and Yam's personality. The beginning of the gospel. It was on a Sunday in spring, a few days after Sri Ramakrishna's birthday, that Yam met him the first time. Sri Ramakrishna lived in the Kali temple on the bank of river Ganga. Now we are discussing how Yam actually met Sri Ramakrishna. Yam, being at leisure on Sundays, had gone with his friend Siddhu, who was his nephew, to visit several gardens in Baranagar. As they were walking in Prasanna Banerjee's garden, Siddhu said, there is a charming place on the bank of the Ganga where a Paramahamsa lives, a great sage is living there. Should you like to go there? Yam ascended and they started immediately to Dakshineshwar. They arrived at the main gate at dusk and went straight to Sri Ramakrishna's room. There they found him seated on a wooden couch facing the east. With a smile on his face, he was talking of God. The room was full of people, all seated on the floor, drinking in his words in total silence and reverence. That is the picture of Yam meeting Sri Ramakrishna for the first time. And what was Sri Ramakrishna speaking? When hearing the name of Hari or Rama once, you shed tears and your hair stands on end, then you may know for certain that you do not have to perform such devotions as the Sandhya anymore. These are, of course, this continues like that is the beginning of the gospel. What charmed Yam to Sri Ramakrishna, what attracted him to Sri Ramakrishna was this. First of all, he felt a special joy when he looked at the figure of Sri Ramakrishna, with devotees sitting around, listening to his words. And then Sri Ramakrishna said, if you utter the name of God and you feel completely lost in that sanctity and sacredness, then you don't have to perform any formal rituals. You don't have to do any, you don't have to go to a temple or a church, because every ritual has a higher purpose behind it. All rituals should eventually culminate in that devotional fervor. That's what Sri Ramakrishna was talking about. When he heard this, he was drawn, and then he goes away. He returns later. Of course, he returns later. And in his second visit, in third visit, he continued. At one point, Sri Ramakrishna made an interesting remark. He said, you can't have your own fate in your hands. You can't decide your own destiny. Then Sri Ramakrishna said something that really struck a chord in his heart. He said, if you have full faith in Guru or God, as an implication, total faith, then by His grace, the greatest tragedies, the problems, hard times, all will vanish. Like clouds disappear when a strong wind blows. When a strong wind blows, all the clouds will disappear. You can read later this, trying to recollect and interpret the real relevance of Sri Ramakrishna's words, and how Yam actually started living a new life from that moment onwards. Yam was a man who was struggling, suffering, though he was such a noble-hearted, compassionate person. Still, because of his family problems, he was going through a very hard time. And he was even contemplating on committing suicide. When Sri Ramakrishna told him, if you have got faith in Guru, means teacher, or God, that's the implication. If you really have faith in God or the name of God, that's what is implied when you utter the name of Hari or Lord or any name of God, immediately if you get completely immersed in that, you feel that you get a kind of ecstatic feeling, and if you completely surrender to God, then all the problems, all the difficulties in life will completely disappear, like clouds will get scattered by strong winds. That was the beginning of a new life in Yam's history. That's a very, very, very important event in his life. Now we should remember that Sri Ramakrishna was a very practical person. If you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you find he addresses his disciples and devotees who came to him according to their needs, according to their requirements. If somebody came with some doubts on spiritual life, he addressed those problems. And if somebody came pretending to be very spiritual, very devoted to God, forgetting his own duties, Sri Ramakrishna won't tolerate that. You can find such an interesting scene in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Mr. Vishwas had been sitting in the room a long time. So a gentleman had come there. He was sitting in Sri Ramakrishna's room, a small room in the Dakshineswar temple. This man was actually not a genuine devotee. So Sri Ramakrishna takes him to task. He now left. He had once been wealthy but squandered everything in immoral life. Finally, he had become indifferent to his wife and children. So this man was very rich, wasted, he spent away, he was a spendthrift, he squandered all the money, all the wealth. Finally, he neglected his own wife and children, and he had come to a temple pretending to be a devotee of God. Sri Ramakrishna did not tolerate that. Sri Ramakrishna, whenever such people came, Sri Ramakrishna asked them, you go back, stay in your home, look after your family duties and responsibilities. So remember, Sri Ramakrishna was a very practical man. He is an unfortunate wretch, Sri Ramakrishna says. A householder has his duties to discharge, his debts to pay, his debts to the gods, his debt to the ancestors, his debt to the rishis, and debt to wife and children. That's the story. So, an householder has got, the Pancha Mahayajnas. That is Hindu tradition. They have to look, they should be compassionate towards living creatures around, Bodha Yajna. They have a sense of indebtedness to the lineage of sages and teachers of ancient times. Then they have a duty to their children, their parents, the distant cousins. They should look after all these. Along with that, they should also pay attention to spiritual practices. That's the ideal life of an householder. So what I mean to say, Sri Ramakrishna was not somebody who went about teaching people renunciation alone. That should be clearly understood. In the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you find Sri Ramakrishna stresses the importance of renunciation. Where renunciation means different things to different people according to the stage of life, the walks of life, the conditions of their life. An householder should not renounce his duties to his wife and children and relatives and other responsibilities. A teacher should not renounce his duties to his students. Similarly, every person should perform his dharma, his own duty, with a sense of sanctity and sacredness. And there are many interesting parables in Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel. I can read some of his parables. It will be very, very interesting and very illuminating. One parable, for example, that we can read, we can think of this is this. Sri Ramakrishna talks about certain spiritual personalities. They are not very common. Some exalted persons who have done a lot of spiritual practices in the past, and as a result they have reached a point of spiritual evolution, but they naturally feel inclined to leading a spiritual life. So he talks about the Homa birds, you find. And he says in the Vedas talk about Homa birds, and these Homa birds, they live in the heavens, high elevation, tens of thousands of feet above the earth, maybe far away from the earth in the higher altitudes. And when they hatch when they give birth to their they hatch eggs, what happened, the eggs start falling to the ground. And as they reach the ground, the eggs will be discarded and the little ones will come out of the eggs, and then they will be looking at the earth. As they are approaching the earth with high velocity, immediately they remember, my mother, I was living in the heavens, I should not come to this earth. I should go back to my high elevation, I should go back to my real home. And the little newborn birds will start flying upward in search of their mother living in the high heavens. It's just a metaphor, an illustration. Like that, Sri Ramakrishna says, there are certain people, certain jivas, who have done a lot of spiritual practices in the past. So they have accumulated a lot of healthy samskaras, good impressions. So they won't have any inclination to live the life of an ordinary household. They won't like to live the life of a worldly person. They, from birth itself, they have a strong inclination to live a spiritual life. This is an example of those who are born with high tendencies, high impressions, sublime spiritual samskaras and impressions. I am just giving an example. You can find in Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel, he talks about different levels of spiritual seekers. He doesn't condemn anyone. He appreciates. He, as I mentioned earlier, he is very positive. He encourages everyone. But he says that you have still some distance to go and you should struggle hard. If a Christian person believing Christianity came, he would tell them you should follow the tenets of your teachings with sincerity, honesty and devotion. If a Buddhist came, he will ask you should follow the teachings of your tradition with a sense of sanctity and sacredness and devotion. Like that, anybody, he always respects. But he says, among the human beings, there are people who belong to different levels of evolution. Nobody is inferior or superior, but we should remember that the same path is not meant for everyone. And then here, the main focus is one of Sri Ramakrishna's own disciples, Keshav Chandra Sen, who was one of the celebrities of the city at that time. He met many followers and admirers, and he was known as a great intellectual who have gone to different parts of the world for giving lectures. He was a prominent person. He is the focus of the present narrative. You can see the other side of spiritual evolution. Right now we discussed how and why those who are endowed with, born with great spiritual samskaras, they will have no inclination to live a worldly life because their samskaras, the impressions are so pure. They cannot tolerate any kind of worldly life. Now another side, Keshav Chandra Sen. And see here, Keshav, one day Keshav came here with his followers. I am reading the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Nikhilanandaji's translation 433 is the verse in the page number. They stayed till 10 at night. We were all seated in the Panchavati. Panchavati is a sacred place outside, but Sri Ramakrishna used to meditate. Pratap and several others said they would like to spend the night here. Keshav said, no, I must go. I have some work to do. So late at night, 10 o'clock, this prominent intellectual said, the earlier plan was to spend that day, that whole night in meditation on the banks of river Ganga. But Keshav said, no, I can't go. I can't do that. I have to go home. Then Sri Ramakrishna laughed and said, can't you sleep without the smell of your fish basket? Once a fishwife was a guest in the house of a gardener who raised flowers. She came here with her empty basket after selling fish in the market and was asked to sleep in a room where flowers were kept. But because the flowers were very fragrant, wonderful fragrance, so this person could not bear the beautiful smell of rose and other wonderful flowers. So she was totally restless. Then the host asked her, "What's the matter? You can't sleep." Of course, now I'm reading, I'm explaining. Then the fishwife told her, "Look here, I can't tolerate this terrible smell of rose and wonderful flowers. So can somebody get the fish basket so that I can sleep peacefully?" And the fish basket was brought, and she sprinkled some water, so the wonderful smell came and she could sleep then. Because of the accumulated samskaras, she could not tolerate the beautiful fragrance of wonderful flowers. What it means is, sometimes we may not be able to even tolerate spiritual samskaras, spiritual associations, but Sri Ramakrishna will not discourage them. You should try again and again. Maybe if that person comes once more, she will be able to enjoy the beautiful fragrance of rose petals and wonderful flowers. So what it means is, our samskaras sometimes create problems in our spiritual life, but we should not be discouraged. We should struggle hard, and then we will be able to overturn our own samskaras and make great progress in spiritual life. There is another interesting parable. There is a well-known parable, and according to some sources, they said this parable is found in the Tripitakas, and this parable is found in the Panchatantra, Kadasari and so on. But Sri Ramakrishna puts in his own unique language in a very interesting context. The parable is that of a poor man. He was a barber by profession. He was actually the king's barber, so he was well paid. He has every reason to be happy about his profession, and he was well paid. He had a happy life. So one day he was passing through the forest, and when he reached near a big tree, he heard a voice calling out, "Do you want the 7 jars of gold?" This voice came from, he didn't know from where it came. It was some kind of a celestial being called a yaksha, or maybe a ghost, maybe a celestial being, maybe an angel, who are maybe called out, "Do you want the 7 jars of gold?" This man he had enough money, but he has the insatiable greed. How desire and greed bring a person to his own ruin. That's the illustration, that's the message of the story. Insatiable greed. We may have everything. We may have $1 billion, still we want 1 billion and 1 million. We want to add $1,000 extra. That insatiable greed. So this man, though he was well paid, he was living a happy life, his wife and children, all needs fulfilled, still he wanted more. So he agreed, "Yes, I want the 7 jars of gold." "All right, I have carried them to your home." He didn't believe. He rushed home and he found in his room 7 jars of gold. The only point was, the 7th jar was not full, it was only half filled. Now you can imagine, just like suddenly you get a news, some announcement, some news that your great ancestor had made you success at the huge estate. say $1 billion or something like that. Then you are not happy, you want to make one more million or something, or maybe a few thousands more. So this man was not happy. He said, the seventh jar is not full. And then he started working hard, struggling hard. He wanted to save money. Maybe he neglected his own family duties. He did not give enough food to his wife and children because he wanted to save money. And with that money, he bought more gold and put in the jar. Still the jar did not fill. Finally, he requested the king to increase his pay. And the king was watching him for some time. Anyway, he doubled his pay. And then again he spent all his money, all his salary on buying gold. He wanted to fill the seventh jar. 6 jars are full. Seventh jar he wanted to fill, and he wanted to see, he wanted to see in front of him 7 jars of gold. Very happy. That's what he wanted. But he could not fill it. Mysteriously, the jar remained only half full. Then he started begging in the streets. Still, he could not do that. He could not fill the jar. And all the money he received by begging, the salary he received from his king, everything was spent to buy gold and fill the 7th jar. But the man was disappointed. The jar won't get filled. Finally, the king began to notice the change that occurred on this man. He had become weak, frail, half-fed, and going in rags. And he found his own wife and children were also going without enough food, because this man was spending all his money on buying gold, and he wanted to fill the 7th jar. He could not. Then king asked him, did you receive the 7 jars of gold? This man suddenly was shocked. So how did you know about it? That ghost asked me also. Ghost means yaksha, some kind of a divine being. He asked me also. But I put a counter question. The king was wiser. He asked, well, can I use it, or is it meant to be hoarded? Just hoarding. No, you can't use it. The yaksha told him. The ghost told him. Then, I don't want it. The king rejected. Immediately, this poor man was his own king's royal barber. This man suddenly discovered his own mistake, and he went to the same place near the tree from where he heard this voice. Please take back your 7 jars of gold. We returned home, and all the 7 jars had disappeared, including all his savings, everything that he had in his home. He had converted into gold and tried to fill the 7th jar. He didn't fill up. This is what happens to human life. This is the predicament. Even if we have everything we want, still the insatiable desire, the greed, desire for more, desire for something else, that the constant innovation, search for something new, something that will titillate our nerves, that will give a feeling of temporary enjoyment. That is actually the cause of problems in modern times. If you look at Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel, if you read it, some of these interesting parables, you can find these parables have a unique relevance to our times. Remember, the context, the story background may be ancient, set somewhere in ancient India, but the central message has got a unique relevance to our times. That's what makes Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual gift, his spiritual legacy, so unique and so relevant and so necessary to our times. So the Gospel is full of such stories and tales and parables. On the one hand, it contains a very profound spiritual philosophy. On the other hand, it contains a number of stories, metaphors, and analogies, funny illustrations, very humorous illustrations, which will directly send a message to the depths of our heart, and we'll suddenly wake up and open our eyes. How wonderful, how relevant. And remember, it is so universal. Sri Ramakrishna's gospel is so universal. It talks about the fundamental human predicament on the one hand and the fundamental spiritual truth on the other. So I conclude this talk today. Sri Ramakrishna's legacy, his spiritual message, that is itself his greatest gift, and it is much more relevant to our times than his own times. As I mentioned in the beginning, Sri Ramakrishna also lived in very turbulent times. India was going through a problem, the first independence struggle, Sipahi mutiny and so on. Europe was going through a difficult period. America was going through a difficult period, the Civil War, everything. So we should remember these problems will continue one way or other. They will change, they will appear in different forms, different shapes, with different names. But the eternal message of Sri Ramakrishna will remain relevant. And some of these illustrations can be studied and contemplated upon, that will help us in facing our own problems in our own times. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. If there is anything you would like to ask, I am most welcome, and we have some time. We can have a short discussion for a few minutes perhaps.
Namaskar, Maharaj.
Thank you. Namaskar. Namaskar.
May I ask about Romain Rolland?
Yeah.
And how the book was received by the world, by this noble Christian.
Yeah, it was very well received. It was very well received. I think it is one of the most widely read books on a global scale. Of course, in India there are bigger versions, but outside India it is very well received, because Romain Rolland's approach is entirely new and very objective, and so it was very well received. One of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, he was awarded Nobel Prize, I don't think it was for a specific work, but of course some of his works were mentioned, but then his approach, his portrayal of some of the sublime universal truths, so it was very well received.
Yeah. Maharaj, what I noticed was that he combines his literary skill with a great spiritual enthusiasm.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. See, he suddenly is like somebody who suddenly discovers something so precious. That's the uniqueness of this. He discovered something so precious and so relevant. Yeah, it was very well received, and is being translated into several languages, as I understand. There are much more elaborate biographies of Sri Ramakrishna, but this book, coming from a gifted writer, which appeared in original French for the first time, it was so well received.
It is the English translation is very available online.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
And I also wanted to ask, if no one else is jumping in, that I wanted to ask about the example of M's spiritual reversal from suicidal
Yeah.
intent. And this is not an isolated example.
Yeah.
This happened quite often
Yeah.
from the descriptions of the history.
Yeah. You're right. This happens. Because
So
our limited understanding and our interpretation of our life from in a narrow spectrum, that is expanded, and we get sense of some deeper undercurrents. We get some different ideas of what life, what it means. Please continue. Yeah, please continue.
Well, the other prominent example that sometimes comes up is Chandragiri Ghosh, the theatrical producer, this genius of the Bengali theater.
Yeah.
And so these two examples show somebody of a spiritual inclination and somebody perhaps with that spiritual instinct in the background.
Yeah.
So that covers the whole spectrum of people for whom it might just be a hint.
Yeah, you're right.
And for those for whom it's an intention.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. You see, these two examples belong to two different levels. On the one hand, M was an extremely well-educated, a very level-headed, highly respected, a very well-disciplined intellectual. And Girish Chandra Ghosh, he was an intellectual with a peculiar connotation, because he was a bohemian. He was more like Dostoevsky. Of course, I'm not comparing. He was drunkard, that's in that respect. And Girish Chandra Ghosh led a very indisciplined life. He had no control of what he did. He himself did not know what he was going to do next moment. He was totally unpredictable. But he had this flash of genius. He could write wonderful plays and dramas. Sometimes this genius for creative activity goes along with some kind of extreme forms of bohemian, licentious lifestyle. That is on the one hand. And this man literally he stormed into Sri Ramakrishna's presence. Yam went as a very well respected gentleman, surprisingly you find following all the etiquettes of those days. You should knock at the door before entering. You can find that Yam in the beginning of the gospel, he followed the etiquette of the modern man. You should not enter a home without prior notice, knock at the door, and you should ask, may I get in? That sort of thing. Girish Chandra Ghosh did not believe in ceremony. He just stormed into Sri Ramakrishna's presence. And actually, Sri Ramakrishna was in a spiritual ecstasy, taking the name of God and in a meditative mood, contemplative mood. Girish Chandra Ghosh was fully drunk. He thought Sri Ramakrishna was in a similar state of mind. He wanted to know the brand of I'm just giving this example to show how Yam was so different from Girish Chandra Ghosh. But both found solace and a new spiritual life in Sri Ramakrishna. Both found. Girish Chandra Ghosh in his own way, Yam in his own sublime, unique way. Yam was the person who could inspire educated, cultured young men to life of renunciation, and they also looked upon him as a teacher. He was a celebrity and he was highly respected, which was a wonderful man. So two examples of two sides of the coin. Both found a message in Sri Ramakrishna and a new life in Sri Ramakrishna. That's the uniqueness of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Swami.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, thank you for the questions. Namaskar. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.
Swamiji, I really appreciated the service this morning.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, sorry for startling you.
Yeah, thank
I think it takes a lot to startle the Swamis.
you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you.